The snow came early that year, like it had something to prove, before the hunters could haul in meat, before the loggers could finish stacking enough wood, before the folks tucked deep in the Rocky Mountain folds had time to plug their roof holes or patch the frost gaps under their doors. The storm rolled down from the high peaks in late October, like a slow-moving punishment, the kind that made strong men ache in their bones, and weak men pray their hearts would stop before sunrise. And it was under that sudden, smothering cold that the mother with the strange hearth sealed shut her cabin door, quietly, without boasting, without asking a thing from the men who had laughed at her the week before. Her name was Hester Lorraine, and no one in Mill Cradle expected her to last the winter. Not after her husband died falling through river ice in February, not after the baby got sick in spring, and the doctor had to be hauled up 2 days late on a mule, and certainly not after the men watched her chip away her old stone hearth, brick by slow brick, only to replace it with something they couldn't quite name, a sunken, muddy-looking oven dug halfway into the floor, ringed by old river rock and packed with clay, ash, and, God help her, animal dung. She layered it like she was making a cake, thick and strange, using no chimney, no flue. It didn't rise like a fireplace. It sank right into the earth, as if she meant to warm the house by setting hell loose under her boards. "Crazy hearth," muttered old Glover, one of the oldest trappers still alive in those woods. "Looks like a gopher mound married a hog pit. That ain't no way to keep a child warm." A chorus of agreement, chuckles, spitting into snow, but Hester didn't answer. She just kept hauling buckets of river silt and mule packs of charcoal ash up from the base of the canyon, while little Clara, her 5-year-old daughter, sat wrapped in a wool shawl too big for her, cheeks already flushed pink from the chill creeping into their thin-walled shack. Hester was no engineer, but she'd grown up watching her grandfather tend earth kilns in Arkansas. He'd once shown her how the old Cherokee used ground heat to bake roots and dry meat, how heat moved sideways if you trapped it under earth instead of letting it run free up a stack. She remembered the way he said, "Most folk fight the cold the wrong direction. Up. You beat it by going down." And now she was the only one in Mill Cradle mad or desperate enough to try it. The town, if it could be called that, was little more than 14 cabins clustered along a frozen creek bed, with elk trails winding between them like drunken paths. These were not genteel frontier families. They were hard, sometimes cruel, mountain men and their wives, living off trap lines, bartering pelts, and watching the sky for signs of avalanche. There was no school, no preacher, just grit, rifles, and the kind of bone-deep pride that made a man mock anything he didn't build himself. So when Hester began building her sunken hearth, word got around fast. Jacob Wintley, who'd tried to court her a month after her husband's death, spat tobacco at the sight of it and muttered, "Guess she'd rather dig holes than share my fire." Even the women whispered, "She'll kill that child with damp heat, mold in the lungs. You wait." But none of them saw what Hester did each night after sunset. The ritual, the whisper of something deeper than desperation. She'd fill the fire belly of the earthen oven not with blazing pine logs like the others, but with low-burning coals fed by pressed briquettes she'd made from ash, mud, and cattle dung collected in summer. She'd let it smolder slowly, a soft heat, contained, no roaring flames, no choking black smoke, just a red glow that sunk into the rock and held there, breathing warmth upward through the floor. She'd covered the whole living area in dried moss and felted quilts stitched together from wool scraps. And over the hearth, she built a second raised floor, just wide enough to fit Clara and herself curled together like squirrels in a hollow. The first week of the snow, the cabin seemed to disappear from the town's talk. Everyone had their own problems. The main trail was buried, the creek froze solid, and Glover's left foot turned gray with frostbite. Even the McKellar boys, who used to race horses through the meadow, now walked with hands tucked under their armpits and eyes narrowed to slits against the wind. But Hester's cabin stayed quiet. And then one morning, maybe 12 days after the last supply mule made it through, the wind shifted, blew hard from the west and knocked down part of the Winthrop shed. Folks went to help. A bucket brigade was formed to stop a flare-up from the spilled lamp oil. And someone, no one remembers who, said offhandedly, "Ain't seen smoke from that widow's shack in a week. Guess she's gone and froze up solid." That's when they started to talk again. 3 men, Jacob Wintley, young Eli Thomas, and Glover, with his half-dead foot, marched to the Lorraine place with a long pine pole, expecting to find the mother and child stiff as boards, ready to break down the door if needed, ready to scold, pity, maybe drag them out. But the door opened before they knocked. And what hit them wasn't cold. It was warmth, dry warmth, a soft, radiant heat unlike anything they'd ever felt in those hills. The inside of the cabin smelled faintly of baked clay and old herbs. The air was still, no smoke, no fire in sight. And there, lying under a patched quilt near the sunken hearth, Clara blinked up at them, rosy-faced and giggling softly. Behind her, Hester stood with flour on her fingers, shaping something in a clay bowl, her cheeks flushed from the heat, not from fever, but from comfort. "Gentlemen," she said, not unkindly, "you're just in time for bread." That moment became legend, but legends grow, strange in the telling. And what came after, what changed the town that winter, was not something any of those men could have guessed as they stepped into that hearth-warmed room, not what that heat would cost, nor how long it would be before Clara ever smiled like that again. Because the storm hadn't even reached its worst, and some men cannot stand to see a woman succeed where they failed. It would have been easier maybe if they'd found her frozen, or at least coughing her lungs raw beside a smoke-choked chimney. But instead, what they found in Hester Lorraine's cabin wasn't weakness. It was comfort, controlled, intentional. Her strange little dugout hearth had worked. And worse, it had worked quietly. No chimney to belch smoke, no logs to split all day, no howl of wind sucking warmth through every crack in the walls. Just a slow, rich heat pulsing up from under the floorboards. Something that made even the thickest jacketed men on that doorstep pause in confusion when they crossed her threshold and realized they were sweating under their coats. And there was the girl, Clara, still pale as any mountain child in winter, but her fingers pink, her eyes alert, giggling like she had no idea what kind of season she was living through. Eli Thomas stared longer than the rest. His niece had died just last March, after her lungs filled from sleeping too close to the draft at night. He barely noticed when Glover muttered, "That ain't natural," and Wintley didn't bother whispering. "Where's the smoke go?" "There's no smoke," Hester replied calmly, kneeling near her hearth. She lifted a clay lid from its circular mouth. "Only smolder. I make my fire before sundown. Seal it in. It burns slow through the night. The heat holds in the stones and the ash bed. Earth helps it breathe." "Fire needs a way out," Glover grumbled, "else the air turns poison. There's a vent low to the ground, near the north wall. It draws, slow and steady." Hester turned back toward her bowl, then glanced at Clara, who had climbed down and was peeking around the men's legs, inspecting Glover's frostbitten toes, wrapped in an old sock. "We're fine, truly." But that wasn't good enough, because pride in a place like Mill Cradle was worth more than proof, and some of the men who stood in Hester's doorway that day went home more angry than impressed. 2 nights later, Glover told the others gathered in the sled barn that Hester must have stolen the idea from back east, or maybe worse. "You ever seen a woman build something like that? Like a mole's burrow? Maybe she's witch-taught, or half Mexican. They build those earth ovens down there, don't they?" "Adobe," muttered someone. "Same thing," said Glover, shifting his boot with a hiss of pain. "What if it catches?" said a different voice. "That kind of heat? Sitting under her floor? You ever heard of a house burning from below?" Wintley chuckled darkly. "Or she just wants us all to notice. Think about it. Her man dies. She refuses help, refuses me, and now she's got the whole town talking. Crazy witch oven," someone muttered, but others said less. Eli Thomas hadn't told anyone what he'd really seen when he peeked closer inside that hearth, while Glover ranted. The inside of the pit was layered with more than ash and rock. He'd seen bits of what looked like old wagon tin pressed into the walls, clay molded around fire-blackened bricks, a system designed. There was nothing haphazard about it, and when he crouched closer he'd felt the heat lift up like breath, not sharp like fire, but slow and warm, like a living thing. He'd gone home that night and stared at his own hearth, its empty mouth cold and black, and wondered if his mother would survive another week of the cold. He didn't sleep. The next morning, he started digging. They came 2 by 2, not to visit, but to watch. Some of the mountain men pretended to stop by Hester's cabin to offer help or share meat, or ask for news of passing mule trains. But they didn't bring meat, and they didn't ask much. They stared at the floor, they peeked at the corners. Some even stepped outside and circled the back, looking for chimneys, signs of smoke, looking for proof she was cheating. "You got a stove hid under there?" one man finally asked, peering through a knothole in the planks. "Gas from the mine. You think we're fools?" "I think you're cold," Hester said, without looking up. That was the day the rumors turned. No longer just whispers of her being strange. Now it was theft, subterfuge, that she must have built her oven with hidden pipe from the mining station 10 miles down the gulch, that she'd somehow tapped into an old gas pocket and would blow her cabin sky high any day now. Or maybe the worst suspicion, that she'd done it right, and they were too proud to admit they hadn't thought of it first. But the weather didn't care about pride. It grew colder, record cold. One morning, snow so thick fell that 2 trap lines vanished overnight. The creek, already iced at the edges, locked solid. A mule froze to death upright in its tether. The wind screamed like something alive. Even the best chinked cabins developed ice rimes inside. Children woke up coughing. Elders stopped speaking. The storm didn't let up. It settled, a siege from the sky. And while men lit fires and stuffed shirts in cracks and cursed at their own freezing walls, Hester's hearth glowed unseen. She'd added a second fire chamber below the first, deeper into the earth, laid a slow trail of sand and ash packed tight that wound under her bedding space. Heat moved from bottom to top, then along the trench, then back again, trapped in a loop of earth and stone. She fed it each afternoon. One small fire, one sealed chamber. The fuel, pressed cow dung briquettes, burned with hardly any smoke, made months ago, with careful layering and sun-drying while the rest of the town laughed at her. They weren't laughing anymore. The first child died on the 15th day of the freeze. The Macready boy, just turned 3. He'd been sleeping beside the fire when it guttered out before dawn. No one noticed till morning when he wouldn't wake up. By evening, 2 more were coughing blood. The town gathered, finally, in the sled barn again, not to gossip, but to panic. 3 cabins now had sick children. 5 men had blackened toes. The men looked older than their years, the women thinner, and still the wind howled. Someone asked where Hester was. "Warm," muttered Wintley. "What if she's got something that could help?" "She's not going to share it," Glover rasped. "She kept it to herself. Let us freeze." "She built it alone," Eli said suddenly, standing at the back. His voice was soft but steady. "Y'all mocked her, told her she was crazy. She didn't owe you." That silenced the room, but the silence didn't last. "She has no right to hide it if it works," someone said. "She's got a duty." "A duty?" Eli shook his head. "She did this to survive. She's got a daughter. That's not duty. That's just being a mother. But men don't like to hear about survival when their own children are dying." That night, 3 of them knocked on her door. They asked politely at first, about how she built it, how she mixed the ash, how deep she dug. She answered quietly, explained what she could, gave them notes written on torn bits of flour sackcloth. But they wanted more. They wanted to see inside the floor, to dig it up, to check for hidden tricks. And when she said no, when she told them it wasn't safe to open it once sealed, especially in this weather, they grew cold in a different way. "We've got families too," one of them said, stepping toward Clara's sleeping form on the raised bed. "If you think we'll let a little girl stay warm while others die, you're not touching her," Hester said, voice low. Her hand gripped the iron poker near the hearth's lip. They paused, all 3 men, for a long moment, and then something shifted. The man closest to Clara looked away. The second stepped back. The third, Wintley, met her eyes but said nothing. They left, but the air in town changed after that. Hester slept that night with one ear open, her hand on the poker. The coals in the oven glowed under the floor, a dull red like an animal's eye blinking from the dark. And outside, men who hadn't prayed in years began to mutter to God, because another storm was coming, and they had nothing left to burn. The storm didn't howl the next night. It whispered, low, unceasing, like 1,000 frozen needles brushing against the walls, sliding under doors, crawling in through hairline cracks in cabins once thought tight. It was the kind of cold that didn't roar or bite. It sank, quiet, heavy. It pressed down on Mill Cradle like a burial cloth. Even the air inside felt thinner. Woodpiles vanished under drifts so deep they might as well have never been stacked. The main trail disappeared. The sky stayed white, not from snowfall but from sheer crushing overcast. A lid closing on a dying world. And in the middle of it, Hester's cabin stood like a secret no one wanted to admit anymore. Word had spread, fast. Not just that she'd stayed warm, but that Clara hadn't coughed once all winter. That bread had been seen rising on a shelf above the hearth. That the woman didn't even burn logs. That was the detail that broke the others. Logs were everything in Mill Cradle. Every man measured his worth by how much he chopped, how well he split, how tall he stacked. Winter prep was a show of strength, of foresight, of manhood. But logs couldn't beat the cold this time. Fires burned fast and smoky, chimneys clogged with ice. Even the best stoves gave out after midnight. But Hester's earthen hearth, that strange hollow buried into the belly of her cabin, it kept going, every night, every morning. Even her windows stayed clear, while others glazed with frost so thick you could chip it with a knife. The town was unraveling. The Macready woman had tried to light her stove using cloth soaked in lamp oil. The fire caught her dress. She'd lived, but her hands were ruined. 2 cabins over, old Glover had collapsed trying to drag a sack of wet coal through waist-high snow. No one found him for a day. When they did, he was alive, but he didn't speak anymore. His frostbitten foot was now black up to the knee. There were whispers now about leaving the mountain entirely, of abandoning Mill Cradle before spring, of sending someone for help, though no one could agree who or how or whether the pass was even open anymore. And still, every man who passed Hester's cabin walked a little slower. Every glance lingered longer, and every one of them hated what they saw. No smoke, no shouting, no desperate sawing, just stillness, warmth, a quiet victory none of them could claim as their own. Hester felt it coming. She didn't need to be told. The men who came by now didn't ask questions. They just stood at the edge of her yard in groups of 2s or 3s, staring. No greetings, no nods, just eyes. Clara asked her once, "Mama, why do the men look at us like we did something wrong?" Hester knelt beside her, adjusted the shawl tight around her tiny shoulders, and said quietly, "Because sometimes folks hate what reminds them they were wrong." Clara thought about that, then frowned. "But I didn't say nothing to them." "You don't have to, baby. You're warm. That's enough." The girl's eyes dropped to the hearth, where a shallow metal tray of root biscuits warmed. She whispered, "Should we share?" Hester didn't answer. She wanted to. Every instinct in her body wanted to throw open the door, call the town together, pass around bread, and tell them how to build the hearth properly. She had explained the basics, hadn't she? They didn't want to listen, didn't want her help, until they decided they were owed it, and she knew what came next. Jealousy that turns into blame, desperation that turns into theft. So she reinforced the vent with stone and clay. She locked the latch on her door. She kept the hearth sealed by night, but checked it more frequently now, testing the drawer, watching for cracks. The heat was steady, almost reverent, like the cabin itself had come alive, like the earth below was holding them the way her husband once did before he fell through that cursed river ice. And just as he had tried to protect her with his body from the cold, now the dirt and ash and stone did the same. But earth cannot protect from men. It happened on the 22nd night of the freeze, the worst one yet, the kind of night when even sound froze in the air, when screams, if there were any, wouldn't carry more than a few feet before being smothered in the dead silence of ice. No moon, no wind, just the thrum of cold settling into the world like death. And through that silence came boots, not hurried, not loud, but heavy, determined. 3 figures, faces wrapped, only eyes visible, axes carried low, not for trees. They didn't knock, they waited, then they kicked. The door held, barely. Hester had reinforced it with crossbars. Another kick. Inside, Clara screamed. Hester didn't scream. She moved. With a speed that belonged not to a widow, but to something hunted for years. Hester lifted the flat stones from the side of the hearth. Beneath them, she'd hidden the last of her father's tools, the ones no man knew she had. A hammer, a hunting knife, an old mountain pistol with 2 shots left. She handed the pistol to Clara. The child didn't blink. She'd been raised in these hills. "Stay behind the bed," Hester said. "You don't fire unless I tell you." A third kick, then wood cracked. They came through fast. The first man tripped. He hadn't seen the lip of the hearth drop and crashed to his knee, cursing. The second hesitated. The third ducked under the low rafter and raised his axe. Hester met him with the hammer. It wasn't a fight. It was panic, chaos. The hearth glowed behind her like a rising sun. The warmth contrasted with the deadly cold pouring in through the door. For a moment the two elements clashed, earth heat and storm chill, meeting in the body of the woman who stood between her daughter and the invaders. Someone shouted. Clara screamed again, closer now. Then the pistol went off. Once, then silence. The aftermath wasn't what anyone expected. By morning the town had gathered, drawn by the sound or the flash, or some primal sense that something had snapped. 3 men lay in the snow outside Hester's cabin. 1 dead, 2 wounded. 1 from the pistol, 1 from the axe that had been ripped from his own hand and driven back into his shoulder. Hester stood on the threshold, black soot on her arms, her dress torn, her eyes wide but dry. Clara clung to her side, silent. No one stepped forward. Then Eli did. He approached slow, hands visible, no weapon, just eyes, full of something deeper than fear or pity. He said only 1 word, "Help," and Hester nodded. By midday, the town changed. Not out of forgiveness, not even from shame, but from necessity. They were dying, and she was the only one who knew how to make the hearth. Eli helped organize it. Not a handout, not charity, a teaching. Hester would show them, on her terms, not with pity, but with clarity. She would teach them how to build the base, how to pack the ash with clay and charcoal dust, how to vent it without losing heat, how to make the dung briquettes that burned slow and long, how to think differently, not upward, but downward, into the earth, into stillness. She led them, quietly, like a ghost in her own village. And over the next 10 days, 11 hearths rose from the snow, some inside cabins, some outside, covered in tarp and mud. Some copied wrong, some half-finished, but all burning differently now, burning slower, lower, with less, and the town began to warm. But what no one saw, what no one asked, was what the hearth had cost her. Clara didn't sleep through the night anymore. She had seen too much. She curled into her mother's side like a kitten pressing into a wound. Hester didn't leave her alone, not ever again, and the hearth that had once been a miracle now pulsed with memory, of heat, of violence, of victory bought too dear. She no longer knelt beside it like a warm altar. Now she stood beside it like a sentry, guarded, watching, because she knew winter wasn't done, and not every storm came from the sky. They stopped calling her a witch after that. Didn't start calling her anything else either. Just Hester. Hester with the hearth. Hester who taught. Hester who didn't bury the man Clara shot, left him outside the threshold until the frost made the decision for her. The other two were carried off in sleds, wrapped in shame and linen, nursing wounds colder than the steel that made them. By the second week of February, the rest of Mill Cradle had changed, not in heart, but in habit. 12 cabins now had sunken hearths. Each was different, some crude, some near replicas of Hester's own, though none quite matched her precision. Still, the results were undeniable. Less wood burned, less smoke poured. Rooms once bitter by night now held their heat till dawn. Children stopped coughing. Women started baking again. Frostbite cases dropped. The men, those still able, hunted and hauled without the usual dread that they'd return to a cabin colder than the snow outside. But no one said, "Thank you." That was not the way of Mill Cradle. They built, they adapted, but they never admitted she'd been right first. Not aloud, not even to each other. Hester didn't ask for thanks. She asked for quiet. She and Clara stayed close, tighter now than they had ever been. The cabin was no longer just home. It was shell, armor, womb. At night they still huddled above the hearth together, even though the bed had room for more, even though others now came to call, bring extra flour, or hang dried fish on her door without knocking. Hester appreciated the gestures, but she kept the door latched. Clara was different too. She didn't smile like she had before. The giggle had vanished. In its place was a wary stillness, a sharpness of eye that no 5-year-old ought to carry. She never touched the pistol again, but she didn't forget where it was either. When Hester moved toward the hearth to check the firebed each evening, Clara moved with her, silent, observing, guarding. Sometimes Hester wanted to say something to ease the weight growing between them, some soft thing about how the world wasn't always like this. But that was a lie, and Clara would know. Children raised in hardship are like the clay she packed her hearth with. They remember the first burn, and they hold its shape. On the third week of February, the thaw began. Not a true spring, not yet, but a change. The wind no longer cut like glass. Snow fell more like dust than knives. Creek ice groaned in the dark, threatening to crack. Sap moved in trees again, and a single raven, seen perched on the Macready chimney, croaked 3 times before flapping off toward the south. Hope began to stir. Men spoke of the pass reopening, of travel, trade, even a mail rider in March. Some wondered if the freeze had broken records. Others talked of rebuilding, new sheds, larger cabins, maybe even a sawmill if the river flow held strong come April. But Hester said little, because warmth, she knew, could be just another trick the season played before killing again, and because of what she saw. It began with Eli. He came to her door one morning, face pale, hands trembling, not from cold, but from something deeper. "My mother's cabin," he said. The hearth cracked. Hester didn't speak. She stepped into her boots, pulled on her coat and followed him. She found the cabin tight and quiet, its interior lined with fur and straw, its corners sealed with sap paste. The hearth, one of the better ones, had been dug properly, vented near perfect. She'd helped build it herself, but the stone ring had shifted. A faint fissure had opened along the firebed's lip. When she leaned close, she smelled something sharp, sour. "Is it gas?" Eli whispered. "No," Hester said softly. "Worse." The fire hadn't died. It had overheated. The vent had iced over during the night. No drawer. The heat trapped below. Pressure building slowly. Not enough to blow, yet but enough to sour the smoke path. The family had been sleeping on top of the bed shelf above it. "They're lucky to be alive," she muttered. Eli shook his head. "They were coughing. Hard. My sister had blood on her lips." Hester said nothing, because now she understood. The hearths weren't just hard to build, they were hard to tend. The town had copied her structure, but not her rhythm, her discipline, her rituals, the slow stacking, the measured layering, the breathing of the fire, the way she watched the coals like they were her own blood. The others had treated the hearth like a tool. She had treated it like a living thing, and now it was turning on them. 3 days later, a second hearth collapsed. Too much ash buildup. A man had added pine logs during a flare-up. The resin caught. Fire licked sideways under his floorboards before smothering, leaving behind poisoned air. His wife woke, gasping. 2 chickens died. By week's end, 4 more had gone cold. Some cracked, some clogged. One was abandoned altogether after the stones split from ice, seeping in during a night thaw. Panic returned to the edges of the town. But now, no one dared knock on Hester's door, because they remembered what they'd done. They remembered who Clara shot. They remembered that her hearth still glowed, unchanged, perfect. On the first full moon of March, Hester awoke to find Clara standing barefoot on the hearthstones, eyes wide. "Baby," she whispered, rising, wrapping her shawl. "You'll catch." But Clara wasn't shivering. She was staring at the flames. The lid of the hearth had been cracked slightly open, just enough to let a tongue of fire whisper out. Not wild, controlled, almost beautiful. The room was filled with warmth that didn't burn, a warmth that held. "I saw Daddy," Clara whispered. Hester froze. Her throat tightened. Clara turned. "He was in the fire, just for a second." Silence. Then Hester knelt and pulled her daughter into her arms. "I think he helped us," Clara said, muffled against her mother's neck. "He sent the fire." "No," Hester whispered into the child's hair. "We built the fire. He just taught us how." They stayed that way until morning, but something had shifted in the town. A new kind of fear, not of Hester, but of what she knew. Men whispered about over-reliance, about how maybe these new hearths weren't natural, that maybe in mimicking her design, they'd upset some balance, that warmth shouldn't come so cheap, that perhaps the earth wasn't meant to give heat that way, not without cost. A boy fell ill after sleeping too near a vent. The McKellar widow swore she heard voices in her floor during the night. One man claimed a snake had slithered up through the hearth trench, warm from below, and coiled under his cot. Superstition bloomed like mold in spring thaw, and Hester saw it coming, the same way she'd seen the first winter storm. She began sealing her hearth deeper, reinforcing the stones, burying the ash chamber beneath another layer of clay. She taught Clara how to scrape the edges clean, how to check for moisture, how to smell the coals. She packed their bread tighter. She boiled water longer. She spoke less, and she waited. Because storms don't end, they only change shape. The second attack was quiet, not violent, just shadows. 2 men, faces hidden. They didn't knock, didn't threaten. They poured water into the side vent, froze it solid, then left. By dawn, the hearth began to smother. The heat dulled. Smoke gathered under the bed shelf. Clara woke coughing. Hester moved like a ghost, silent, urgent. She uncovered the emergency vent path, a narrow clay tunnel that led under the wall into a trench she'd dug months ago and hidden beneath stacked firewood. She cleared it with her bare hands, coughed until her lungs bled. The hearth breathed again. Clara survived, but the message was clear. Some still wanted her gone. She didn't report it, didn't accuse, didn't even speak to Eli when he came to check on her the next day. She just nodded and kept her door shut. But the fire in her eyes when she opened the hearth that night was no longer quiet. It was furious and steady. She didn't build that hearth to prove anything. She built it to survive. But now it was something more, a statement, a warning, a legacy, something they could burn her cabin down to the dirt and still never understand. Because fire, real fire, the kind that warms without roaring, the kind that lasts, comes not from the trees, but from within. The last freeze of the season came like a thief, not bold, not loud, but sudden and absolute. No warning wind, no build of clouds, no howling snow, just a sharp drop in temperature so cruel that window panes cracked without a sound, and skin froze in seconds if exposed. It swept through Mill Cradle like a reaping wind, catching those who'd dared believe spring had arrived, those who'd unsealed vents, who'd pulled their bedding thinner, who'd dared sleep a little farther from the fire. By morning, 5 cabins were silent. The boy who'd slept near a hearth vent, dead, an elder couple, gone in their bed, a woman who'd carried water too far without gloves, fingers black, fever climbing. In the still morning air, you could hear wood splitting from the cold, hear frost creeping in walls, hear quiet crying from homes where blankets were stacked higher than prayers. And through that silence, again, rose the old question. Where's the heat? And then the newer one. Where's her? The town didn't gather like before, not in the sled barn, not in pairs whispering by the creek. This time, they simply moved, quietly, as one, toward Hester's cabin. She saw them coming. From her high window, cut into the gable, where she'd carved an open channel to let the warm air draft across the ceiling, she saw the shapes in the snow. Men, women, children, not armed, not angry, just desperate, their bodies hunched, heads low, steps heavy, like pilgrims, not beggars. She didn't wait for the knock. She opened the door. The heat spilled out around her like a miracle. The air steamed. Her shawl hung open. Clara stood beside her in only a linen dress, cheeks red with sleep, a bowl of hot porridge cradled in her hands. No one said a word, not at first. Then the oldest woman in the town, a trapper's widow named Marda, who'd buried 2 sons to cold and one to fever, stepped forward, eyes red. She whispered, "Will you show us again?" Hester didn't nod. She stepped aside, and the first 5 entered, then 10, then the children. No one spoke of the past. No one asked about the night Clara shot a man. No one muttered about witches or stoves or shame. The fire had done what fire always does. It had made them forget everything but the need to be warm. And this warmth, this deep, radiating, whole-body warmth, it undid them. One man wept without knowing. A woman kissed her daughter's hands just to feel they were warm again. Eli stood near the hearth, eyes fixed on the stones, and said quietly, "This isn't just heat, this is life." Hester still didn't speak, but her eyes found Clara's. And Clara, without asking, took the second ladle of porridge, walked toward the group and offered it to a child no older than herself. The child took it like it was gold. For 3 days, the town rotated through Hester's home. She refused to let more than 12 in at a time, not for pride, but safety. She gave each family a lesson, not in how to copy the hearth, but how to tend it, how to breathe with it, feed it slow, seal it tight, trust the coals, listen to the silence of the stones, feel the warmth rise not in roaring waves, but in long, patient breaths. She gave them her father's old ash mixture recipe. She showed them how she packed the clay base with sand, how she used wool wadding to soften the heat rise under the beds. She warned them that heat like this was alive, not a tool, not a trick, not something to master, but something to respect. She didn't charge coin, she didn't trade, but when they left, each person left behind something small, a slice of dried meat, a length of twine, a button, a prayer, not because she asked, but because they had nothing else, and the human heart knows what it owes. By the first week of April, the pass opened, not wide, but enough. A mule train staggered in, letters came, news from the valley, supplies, but none of it mattered more than the warmth. The last cold night passed without a death. For the first time since early winter, no one in Mill Cradle coughed by morning. The thaw had truly come, and Hester's cabin no longer stood alone in its warmth. All through the town, a new kind of silence held, not the silence of fear, but of peace, the hush that comes when suffering pauses, when survival finally blooms into rest. But not for Hester, not entirely. One morning, weeks later, Eli found her out past the ridge, kneeling in the mud. She was digging deep into the slope behind her cabin. Her hands were raw, her eyes red. He knelt beside her. "What are you doing?" "Preparing," she whispered. "For what?" She looked at the earth, then at him. "For next time." Eli didn't answer. He just placed his hand over hers and helped her dig. Together, they laid the frame for a new kind of chamber. Bigger, better vented, safer. Not for her, for Clara, for others. Because warmth, once proven, must grow. The town changed its name that year. Just a quiet note passed from letter to letter, signed on the next shipment to the valley. No longer Mill Cradle. Now it was called Hearth Hollow. No official vote, no preacher's blessing. Just a truth everyone agreed on, though no one said aloud. They owed her. But Hester didn't care about names. She cared about fire, the kind that doesn't roar, the kind that lasts, the kind that lives long enough to keep a child warm in the night. Clara slept soundly again by summer. The pistols stayed under the bed, untouched. The hearth, never cold. And when the wind shifted wrong or frost whispered too early in the air, Hester would light it again, even if no one else did, because some storms never show their face, and some fires must be kept, whether anyone sees the smoke or not.